Welcome to the Space for Diplomacy podcast by Spaceport Sarabhai, India's space policy think tank. I'm your host, Susmita Mohanty. This podcast series features conversations on far-ranging topics such as geopolitics, tech diplomacy, international cooperation, and all things space. Today, I'll be speaking with Dr. Tanja Masson-Zwaan, who is joining me for this conversation from The Hague in the Netherlands. We hope to discuss, among other things, export controls and technology diplomacy, the role of arbitration and dispute resolution, space resources, and lunar governance. Tanja, welcome to the Space for Diplomacy podcast.
Thank you very much, Susmina. Nice to be here.
Dr. Tanja Masson-Zwaan is Assistant Professor and Deputy Director of the International Institute of Air and Space Law at Leiden University. She's President Emerita of the International Institute of Space Law and a former Vice President of the International Astronautical Federation. Tanja advises the Dutch government on space law issues and was co-founder of the Hague International Space Resources Governance Working Group. The Dutch government appointed her as an arbitrator for space-related disputes at the Permanent Court of Arbitration. Tanja holds adjunct professorships at Wuhan University and Lewis University in Rome. She serves on the boards of organizations including the Open Lunar Foundation and the Space Sustainability Rating. In 2020, she received the Royal Decoration as Officer in the Order of Orange-Nassau for her contributions to space law. Tanja, I'd like to begin with the relevance of the 1967 Outer Space Treaty and the 1979 Moon Agreement in a multipolar world order that we now inhabit. So alongside these foundational treaties, we now have competing frameworks like the US-led Artemis Accords. We have China, Russia with their own cooperative initiatives. Are we seeing fractures in multilateral space governance?
That's an interesting question. And the two treaties you name, the Outer Space Treaty of 1967 and the Moon Agreement of 1979, are respectively the first and the last international treaties that were agreed in the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, or UN COPUOS. And they are also quite extreme in, let's say, their success rate. The Outer Space Treaty has been ratified by nearly 120 states. And the Moon Agreement only by 70, and is only also the only treaty where a state has ever withdrawn from the treaty, because of course you can adhere to a treaty, but you can also withdraw. And that has never happened to any of the 5 space treaties, but for the Moon Agreement, where Saudi Arabia withdrew a few years ago. So they are quite extreme, and the Moon Agreement is sometimes called a failed treaty because in addition to the fact that it's only 17, it also does not include any of the space powers that we are dealing with. As you mentioned, United States, China, Russia, they're all not parties to that agreement. So it doesn't really count, if you like. It is a pity because it is, of course, a youthful treaty. It deals with commercial issues. It is part of international law, but for various reasons, it has not been widely adhered to. The Outer Space Treaty, on the other hand, yes, has definitely been a very successful treaty and still is. And despite the rhetoric that we're hearing, including very recently with NASA announcing its far-reaching moon plans and saying we're here to stay and things like that sound a bit chilling. The treaty has been observed for nearly 60 years of space use and exploration, and I think that I hope, I know that it will be continuing to be relevant because states need to work together even in complex missions to the moon or beyond. There is always international cooperation. So yes, we have these new initiatives like Artemis Accords, which has nearly 70, I think now, signatory states, but it's not a legal document. It's a political statement of principles of states that would like to work with the US in the Artemis program. It restates some of the principles of the Outer Space Treaty, and it goes a bit in more detail. It tries to implement, or the word they use is operationalize, some of the principles of the treaty. So we can go in more detail later, but for instance, the concept of safety zones is a new thing that was included there, but that could be seen as putting into practice an article of the Outer Space Treaty. So I don't think that there is, let's say, that the Outer Space Treaty is less relevant. You do see a two-track approach, if you want to call that a fragmentation, maybe. On the other hand, there is still diplomacy going on in the United Nations. They're working towards principles, towards cooperation and transparency on the moon and so on. So I don't think that we should use that word, maybe.
In fact, when you mentioned safety zones, I think the two words that stood out when I first read the Artemis Accords were exactly safety zones and also the clause on resource utilization. So I think those are going to be tricky. You've been an observer of the UN COPUS Legal Subcommittee sessions for decades now. For people who have never been in that room, what actually happens there? Is it where space law gets made, or is it that the real work really happens somewhere else entirely?
Well, it's definitely where international space law is made. And, COPUS was started in 1958, so 1 year after the space race started with the Sputnik 1 launch. And that started with about 20 states that were member of this committee that became a permanent committee of the United Nations. Has two subcommittees, one of which is the legal subcommittee, and the other is the scientific and technical subcommittee. So they meet separately. Scientific and technical subcommittee meets each year 2 weeks, and then legal subcommittee meets 2 weeks, and then they meet in a plenary session to confirm all the decisions and the work that was done. Today, COPUS has more than 100 member states. And that is wonderful, because many states realize that if they want to be a part of the creation of legal principles governing space, they should participate in this committee. So states can become a member, and then they send delegations to these meetings. And they work with a very formal UN, diplomatic kind of style, preset agenda. So every item that comes on the agenda has to be agreed by what we call consensus. Every decision is made by consensus, so everyone has to agree. And you can imagine that that's much more difficult now with 100+ states than it was in the beginning. And that also means that the decisions on new instruments take a long time, because everybody has to be able to say to give their view, to give the view of their country, because the delegates are there as representatives of their country. And so the latest, for instance, document that was adopted, the long-term sustainability guidelines in 2019, took nearly 10 years to be negotiated. And the current discussions about space resources, and we have a working group on making principles for the use of resources that we might find in outer space, has a 5-year mandate. They are on the way getting there, but it is a very tedious thing. Every word, every comma, everything has to be agreed by consensus. So it's slow, it's sometimes boring, it takes lots of diplomatic skills. It has become much more political than it used to be in the world that we live in today. Obviously, the geopolitical tensions are felt. A few years ago, for the first time ever, I experienced walkouts. When there was there was talk about the Russian invasion in Ukraine, the European Union observer, because you have organizations that are observers, had said to all the EU member states, we have to get up and leave the room. And we leave only the interns in the room, and they can call us back in when the discussion is over. So that I had never experienced in UN COPUS. And it hasn't happened again. I have to say, things have perhaps calmed down a bit, but you certainly feel there is more tension. But it's still the only place where all these countries sit in the same room in alphabetical order, behind their placards, and so you might have Israel next to Iran, for instance. So it is really an important forum, and we absolutely need to preserve that.
So did I hear right that you earlier said that 1979 Moon Agreement was the last legal treaty? Um, and since then, there have been no legally binding treaties that have been discussed in Corpus or created. I mean, it's been principles and guidelines mostly, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Moon Agreement was the last hard law instrument. Since then, it is soft law, and that is because that consensus is so hard. It's also because states are much more inward looking. You know, in the 1960s, we came out of the World War and the Cold War, and states were really eager to protect this new realm of discovery for peaceful purposes, to make sure that it wouldn't be in weapons race. And so there was this big drive towards international cooperation and doing things together nowadays. And you see that in many states there is extreme right movements and nationalistic movements. Everybody wants to have their country count first. And those states are simply less eager, less willing to give up sovereignty to agree to a legally binding instrument. And that's not only in space, but in all other areas of international law as well, which is a pity, because obviously it would be nice to have a treaty on space debris, which is a serious problem, or other topics. But for the other hand, these guidelines and principles can be implemented into national law, and then it means they will become binding through national law on the private entities, which are nowadays a major actor next to states. So I don't see the fact that it is soft law as a big issue, even though ideally I would also prefer a treaty. But it is more important to get that consensus, even if it is not in hard law, to at least get agreement on rules of the road, let's just, so to say.
You've co-founded the Hague Space Resources Governance Working Group. And I know we are awaiting the report from the Legal Subcommittee on Space Resource Utilization, which Stephen Freeland heads, which I believe coming out next year. So you came up with this working group at a time when lunar mining was still largely speculative. Now, with China having conducted 2 successful lunar sample return missions, India having landed near the south pole of the moon, a Japanese private company has also landed on the moon, and Artemis 2, we just had the astronauts do a lunar flyby successfully. How urgent is it to resolve the legal question of who can extract and own what? And is consensus even achievable?
Yeah, that's a fair question. Indeed, we founded the Hague Working Group when we saw those first companies emerge, Planetary Resources and Deep Space Industries, which are no longer there. And so let's be fair, this activity is also very difficult, and is saying we're in a rush. I don't think we're in a rush, because we have had a few attempted landings, maybe one successful by a private entity, but it's hard. And so the urgency is certainly there, but it is not as if they're going to mine water tomorrow, right? So we do have some time. We did acknowledge at that time, it was about 2016, that we started this work, and we worked for 4 years on a set of building blocks. It was perhaps speculative, but it was also a realization that this was something that would be happening, and that it would be good to talk about the substance, to really think about what topics should a regime. We did not even call it a legal framework, but we said a framework or a regime. What topics should that contain? That's really what we worked on, and that work is also now part of the UN Working Group on Space Resources that you mentioned, that indeed has to deliver its report in 2027. So this work is, let's say, an input to that working group, and will help, hopefully be useful for it. And there are other initiatives that have taken place, but the Hague Working Group is, I think, the building blocks are appreciated broadly. So I'm proud of that work we did. And I hope that some of those principles will find their way. We did see some of them find their way also, by the way, in the Artemis Accords, because the safety zones, for instance, was also in one of our building blocks. So the urgency is there, but I do think that both the law and the technology still have a bit of time. So the urgency was also expressed by the fact that there were some states that adopted national law. And the United States started with that in 2015. So that was actually also just before we started with the Hague Working Group. So we did see that tendency that industry was knocking on the door of their government saying, we want to start looking at this, but we need legal certainty. Can we do this? Can we own the resources? That was the major question. And what conditions would apply. And so that was followed by a few other countries. And I think even India also has a policy on this. And of course, it's in no one's interest to, at some point, have 100 national laws that say something about space resource mining. It is better for everybody to have some common guidelines, rules of the road that then can be implemented into national law, so that we have some coordination or even harmonization among those principles.
It's interesting that you mentioned the two companies, Planetary Resources and Deep Space Industries. I used to be in San Francisco for 10 years, and I remember the early days of Planetary Resources and DSI. We had an intern who went on to work for one of them. So I think they were definitely early in the game, but if you see how the startup landscape is in the US, hype can take you to some distance, not so in Europe or in India, but I think it kind of works there. And they were talking about asteroid mining, which I thought back in the day, totally far-flung and unachievable. But yes, I think the lunar thing seems to be close at hand. It's on everybody's radar. Not that extraction is going to happen tomorrow, but I think it's definitely something we all need to think about. Coming back to the Outer Space Treaty, it bans sovereignty over quote-unquote celestial bodies, but it is silent on whether you can own what you extract. I remember there was, I believe, a law passed during the Obama administration in 2015, if I'm not mistaken, where the US Congress has, I believe, unilaterally decided that American companies can go bring back material from other celestial bodies and own them. You can correct me if I'm wrong. And you have written, I believe, with Dimitra Stafaudi, one of the articles that resource utilization is now generally seen not as prohibited. That's a remarkable minilateral consensus that seems to have emerged without a new treaty. How did we get there? And is it durable?
Yeah, that's also a fair question. Indeed, the question whether resources can be owned was the reason for that national law in the US, and then followed by Luxembourg and the UAE and Japan and India with a policy in Brazil, I think, and even the most recent national law in Europe, Italy, was the same. So they do not give a kind of free rider to private companies to go and mine. What these laws say is that in the view of their country, owning resources is something that can be allowed. It still means that a private entity has to be authorized and supervised, has to get a license, has to get insurance, and all that. So it is not a carte blanche. That is just to clarify. So those laws try to answer a general question. The treaty, the reason is that the Outer Space Treaty indeed does not say anything about resources. It does say outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies, cannot be appropriated, Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty. And so the question arises, what about if we find water, what can we do with it? Can we touch it? Can we not own it? And so that was the first main question, and that was also the initial reaction in UN COP was. Along the way, and the fact that we now have this working group, that is by definition an acknowledgement that it is not per se prohibited to own resources. What we're doing now is making rules of the road, making guidelines on how we should govern the use of space resources. There is a theory in international law based on some case law that says everything that's not prohibited is in principle allowed. Of course, it still has to comply with international law. It should not be violent, aggressive, or whatever, but it is not per se prohibited. I always say the whole fact that the Moon Agreement was concluded and it was adopted by consensus that I mentioned earlier, And that treaty deals with resources, and it says when exploitation is about to become feasible, we should make a regime to govern the use. So I think even in the early days, there was not, let's say, an intention of the drafters that should we find water, metals, helium, whatever, no one can ever touch it. And I think that that would actually be contrary to the whole, even looking at the preamble of the treaties, which say, they refer to the great prospects that outer space can bring for humanity. So the trick is not to prohibit it, but to guide it and to regulate it so that it doesn't become a land grab or a gold rush or whatever you want to call it.
If I were to draw a parallel between outer space and Earth, I mean, here we have Antarctica, the Arctic. I believe the 1959 Antarctic Treaty has worked out reasonably well. Antarctica has not seen, I mean, there was in the initial days of exploration, there was, whaling happened in big ways, seal killing and for blubber and so on. However, I think the treaty has held, and more or less Antarctica has not seen extraction at scale. However, the Arctic, the story is different. So do you think any of these treaties here on Earth, are there takeaways for us if we were to come up with guidelines for the moon, for example, in terms of how to make it work?
Absolutely. I believe that there are analogies where we can draw lessons, and you mentioned Antarctica, and there's also the deep sea bed, where there's also the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea and various other instruments and institutions. Analogies are useful but never perfect. So Antarctica, there are several states that have staked a national claim on Antarctica, and they agreed to freeze that, and they agreed to not have any commercial activity for a certain period, and that expires, I'm not sure when, in a few years. So then we will see what happens there, and it has been decided to preserve it for research. The seabed is also an area where we have resources, where there is even an international seabed authority that was established. There is a tribunal for the law of the sea, so that's also an interesting analogy. There also the mining code is still being developed. Has been on the agenda for 20 plus years or so. But quite surprisingly, a few years ago, there was a new treaty that was adopted, the so-called BBNG treaty. It has a long name, but it's about protection of the biodiversity of areas beyond national jurisdiction. And that's an interesting analogy. And it is striking that that is a binding, a hard law treaty, which entered into force last January when there were 60 states that ratified it. It's a high threshold. And which has certain rules about, for instance, environmental impact assessments that have to be conducted. So that realization that we have to be careful about the long-term sustainability of these areas has actually then led to the adoption of a treaty. So we should also maybe keep our hopes up. But again, analogies are interesting. We can learn lessons from them, good and bad, and there are good and bad, but they are never perfect.
Well, it's encouraging to hear that the seabed, the treaty that you mentioned, got a consensus with 60 nation states. I think that's remarkable.
It's, by the way, not the seabed, but the high seas. But it's still
Okay.
a treaty on international law, and that is indeed remarkable. Yeah.
You sit on the International Civil Aviation Organization Space Learning Group, and you've pointed out that where airspace ends and outer space begins has been an unresolved UN agenda item for over 40 years. So for our listeners, why has this been so hard to settle, and who benefits from keeping it ambiguous?
Yeah, this topic indeed has been forever on the agenda of UN COPOS. And as I said earlier, that's a very diplomatic process. So you would actually have to have everyone agree to take it off the agenda. So that is also, once it's on there, it's going to be very hard unless you resolve it by adopting a treaty or whatever, and the topic is resolved. But unresolved topics tend to stay for a very long time on the agenda. Why is this unresolved? Because so far it has not really been urgent or created issues, said that there is no international boundary between airspace and outer space. But of course, the advent of suborbital flights puts that question more squarely on the map. And so that is why it's still there. Why is it not resolved? You could, of course, easily say, okay, we say 100 kilometer is the boundary, and some states have done that in their national law. But the point is that some states do not want that boundary. They prefer to have that fluency, because in airspace, everything is prohibited unless allowed. And in outer space, it's the contrary, right? We have that freedom of use and exploration. So you can sort of move the boundary into your national security activities, or whatever, extend the freedom or limit it according to your national security needs. And so there are several countries, including the United States, but also my country, the Netherlands, who say it is not necessary to solve this. It has never created an issue. And even the suborbital flights, that was the reason why it becoming important again. But so far, these flights take place in the national framework. They only take place in the desert in the United States, as you know, Virgin Galactic and Blue Origin. But once these flights might become international traffic, and that is why ICAO, as you mentioned, the International Civil Aviation Organization, at some point also became interested, is that we could have flights from point A to point B on Earth via suborbital space. And then it becomes international travel, and thus international law would apply. And then we need to really know, do we apply air law or space law? Because they are very, very different. So that's why ICAO and UNUSA at some point got together and created this learning group. Even there, it has been, sorry, it has been put a bit on the back burner, because I haven't heard from them in a few years, I have to say. So it's there also, again, considered not really urgent, I guess.
Yeah, now that you mentioned suborbital flights, it does put things in context. I remember reading that one of the two, with either Blue Origin, I think it was Blue Origin, that considers 100 kilometers as the beginning of space, or the edge of space. And I think Virgin Galactic, which goes up with a space plane, it's 83 kilometers or something. I think there is a discrepancy there, and now I get it. Now I see what you're saying. It makes sense.
Of course, these companies want their passengers, want their clients to know that they're astronauts, they're going to space. That's the exciting
Yes,
thing
indeed.
about it. So that's why it is important. But and they are also, it is an interesting question. But one of them goes up vertically, and the other is a little rocket under a plane. And so, are they different? Are they the same? It will be a lot of interesting legal questions that come up.
So for now, we can let it be a gray area. It's not worrying any of us.
There are more urgent problems, yeah.
Yes, indeed. So space technology, as both of us know, has always been dual use, and increasingly so. Export control regimes like ITAR and EAR, which I personally also am very familiar with, having been a foreign national at Boeing, they're shaping who can participate in the global space economy, because there are also smaller nations now with fledgling programs that want to be part of this, new economy. How do export controls interact with the principle of the quote-unquote province of all mankind enshrined in space law? And are they a tool of geopolitical exclusion?
I guess they could be used as such, but that is, of course, not their initial intention. And you started by saying something that's very true. Space is dual use and dual purpose. Space, any space object can be used peacefully, in a civilian manner, and can also become a weapon, basically, and be more aggressive in style. So the topic of export control exists, of course, as you know, beyond space. It is something that is everywhere. Every country has certain items it has to be careful about to protect its national security. So that is the first reason why we have these export control regimes. If they are used, on the other hand, for economic purposes, then it becomes indeed more doubtful, and could act as a restrictor of openness and freedom. And this has maybe happened a bit in the US with many items that were on those lists, and it was basically impossible to do anything which had a little screw from the US, or even have a phone call, and you would need already a separate agreement to protect yourself. So it was very extreme, and I'm not an expert, and you're probably better familiar, but I know that there have been some reforms, and that they have loosened a little bit the reforms. The reaction, for instance, in other parts of the world was that they were making ITAR-free satellites, that we would have circumvent that problem. It can be very far-reaching. I had a practical example of this here in the Netherlands, where we have a law on space activities, and so companies have to get a license to operate their satellites. And I was part of the audit team, and we asked the company for certain documents to assess, the safety and the compliance of their activities. And they said, well, we cannot give you that because it's ITAR protected. And so the government had to get a technical assistant agreement, or whatever it's called, from the US to be able to have a look at those documents to assess whether it would give a license. So this was really a very extreme, I think, example of how a US law that is made to protect US interests would restrict a foreign government in assessing whether it would allow a company to carry out its space activities. So, I mean, and there's always a way around it, but the problem is that our law says we have to decide within 6 months. And we came across this problem along the road, and so there was also a time issue. Now we know this, and so we take it into account from the start, and we tell companies, if you apply, if there are issues like this, think of this in advance. But so there is a rationale for these export control regimes, but indeed it can also restrict free trade for sure.
So exactly like you said, I facilitated the launch of the first American satellite, private satellite, on an Indian rocket. And we also had to go through the TAA. First, of course, it was 5 years of soft diplomacy to override the sanctions that were imposed on India in 98. But also the TAA had to be signed to make a waiver with the existing residual sanctions. It is very, very cumbersome. And the list of munitions, if you look at the list, there were some items which were during the Obama administration. For the first time ever, they call it reforms. They moved it, I believe, from the Department of State to the Department of Trade or Commerce to make it a little easier to get your permissions. But yeah, it's still very cumbersome. And I think there is a reason, there's good reason for it, having worked in the US space industry for a long time. I think ITAR is a very useful diplomacy tool for them. It's also a very useful tool that they can weaponize from time to time if they need to. So I think it's not going away anytime soon. So let's talk about debris a little bit, because I think that's something we're all very concerned about. There is no binding obligation to clear up space debris. And both you and I know that there is pushback, especially from big companies, to have any kind of regulatory counterweights for operators launching thousands of satellites. So we have things like the Space Sustainability Rating, for example. You're on the board. I was part of the team that sort of worked on it. But these are just voluntary things that people can sign up to show that they can be responsible actors. So the question to you would be, the states, so my concern here is the states that are best positioned to impose those counterweights are often the home states of those very operators who are pushing back. So how do you break that tension? How do you bring in regulatory safeguards?
Yeah, fair question. And I am not sure what the answer is, but I do think that there is a growing awareness also among those actors that it is also in their interest that something has to be done. I mentioned that tragedy of the commons. If we just do whatever we want and nobody takes care, nobody will be able to use outer space, and we cannot go through that belt in Leo even to go to the moon and beyond. So it is, I think, a growing awareness. I was interested also to see when I spoke with someone at a large satellite operator who said, when we have young people who come and apply for jobs, they ask us what our ESG policy is, rather than asking for a company car. They now ask, they call companies to take their responsibility. And so there's also that push from the bottom up, which I found quite interesting. And you see the fact that the Space Sustainability Rating, for instance, has given out certain ratings. We have several large companies such as Eutelsat, which has actually gone through the process. It's voluntary, but it can bring benefits not only in showing that they are a responsible space actor, but perhaps it can also create incentives like better insurance conditions. It could also be a factor that can actually have legal consequences, because if there is a collision in outer space, as you may know, we have a fault liability system that applies. If you can show that you are a responsible actor, that you have gone through the sustainability rating or whatever other mechanism, perhaps a judge would less easily say that you are the liable party at fault because you have done everything in your power to not be commit a fault. So, I mean, those are, of course, theoretical musings, but I think that they can indeed have an impact. I do also think that we will go through a process where there will be more strict requirements. As you may know, in the European Union, there is this big project for the EU Space Act that everybody talks about now, which will have far-reaching obligations, mostly built after the French model, which is currently the national law that has the most strict debris mitigation requirements. And the European Union Space Act is sort of built on that model. If that goes through, and the negotiations are still very much ongoing for quite some time, but then that will become directly applicable in 27 EU member states. And that could also have the so-called, Brussels effect, as we also had with privacy legislation, that then becomes sort of the global standard. So we're way not there yet, but I do see on the one hand that realization among all the actors that something needs to be done, and on the other hand also the continuing development of space traffic management rules and this EU law and so on that are taking place.
I think it's interesting that you mentioned insurance because, depending entirely on companies and the leaders of these companies to shift behavior is one aspect, but I think the hard aspect here is insurance, and I think that's a very good driver.
Well, I think always it's good to insist on incentives rather than just penalizing. It is always good to convince why it is important to do something and to change behavior, basically, rather than putting penalties and whatever.
So the Dutch government has appointed you as an arbitrator for space-related disputes at the Permanent Court of Arbitration. So has there been any case yet related to space debris, for example, that we just discussed?
Yes, there hasn't been any case at all that has used these special rules that were adopted in 2012, if I'm not mistaken, so quite a long while ago. Special rules were adopted by the Permanent Court of Arbitration, which is seated next to the International Court of Justice here in The Hague, and which were adopted with the aim of having arbiters and technical specialists who know about space, so that you have specialized experts who can help solve a dispute. Arbitration is especially interesting in case of disputes between, for instance, a state and a company, or between two companies. The International Court of Justice would be rather where you go for a dispute between countries. Arbitration can also be more closed, so it can protect commercial interests, and it does not become a case law like in the jurisprudence sense. And so the thought was that this would be interesting and useful. In practice, I have to say it hasn't ever been used. The member countries of the PCA can actually appoint experts as to be on the list, so that these parties in a dispute can choose their arbiters. But we haven't had any case law at all in space law, so not even in an international court, even though the Liability Convention foresees in the establishment of a claims commission. And of course, there are always provisions in contracts and agreements about dispute settlement and they often refer to the Paris or London arbitration tribunals, which is the practice in many industries. So unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, there hasn't ever been a case, but yeah, I'm still on the list, so I'm still appointed, and that was renewed. And so perhaps I think that possibly in the future this will become more relevant because we have so many more private parties, right? We have, and there will be disputes and there will be issues. So I'll keep you posted if a case ever comes.
Well, I have to admit, I'm really surprised that you haven't had to take on a case yet at the PCA, because I had imagined the PCA would be a great place for startups, for example, who don't have the reserves to go through long legal cases. Or I thought when I read about the Permanent Court of Arbitration, I thought it'd be a great place for, let's say, I'm somewhere on an island in the Indian Ocean and a part of Starship just explodes over me. So where do I go? I mean, there has to be some court somewhere for even independent citizens who might be affected by space activities. So, well, I hope you'll have your case soon at the PCA. I'm surprised. So let's talk a little bit about the satellite interference landscape. You've spoken about ongoing satellite interference, straining diplomatic relations. When a state jams or spoofs another satellite, it can have devastating consequences. So what legal remedies exist today?
Not so many. It's true that we have, again, a principle. The Outer Space Treaty is a treaty on principles. It doesn't go into details. That was also not its intention. So likewise, for this problem, as for the debris problem, we have the famous Article 9, which is the longest article in the Outer Space Treaty, which says states have to have due regard for each other's activities, and they should try to avoid harmful interference. And if there is a risk of harmful interference, they should enter into consultations with each other. So there is no prohibition on harmful interference, because basically that's a technical issue that cannot be completely excluded. But there is an obligation for international consultations or for bilateral consultations. To my knowledge, that has never been activated. It might be that states have done that, not in the public, of course, but there is no public record of states invoking that article directly, saying, hey, your activities interfere with my activities. For instance, Starlink interferes with astronomy. I want to sit around the table and try to find a solution, which would be good. And maybe that will happen in the future again, as we have more conflicts that might come up. So it's hard. We also have the International Telecommunication Union that plays a big role here, because that's the international organization, specialized agency of the United Nations that manages the orbit frequency spectrum and allocates frequencies and so on. And that also has rules about interference that should be limited. And if there is interference, there should be consultations. And they also have even further going rules about dispute settlements. And they have the Radio Regulations Board, which can intervene, or the Bureau. So there is perhaps more teeth, but it still remains an intergovernmental organization. And intergovernmental organizations always depend on sovereign states willing to work in that system. And there, so the same thing, we haven't had any big decisions, although jamming and spoofing is definitely happening at increasing scale, and it's perhaps even more risky as a kind of hybrid warfare than having an actual weapon in space, because it's relatively easy to disturb a satellite system on which there is so much dependence. But there hasn't been, again, any clear solution, although there also the naming and shaming mechanism that I mentioned earlier works. So when you have ITU meetings, or they even come to COPOS and they say, hey, my satellite signals are being disturbed and it seems to come out of this or this country, that country will say, oh no, that's not me, but the next day it may end. So there is certainly, again, that international balance of states still having to cooperate in a multinational system. Nobody is alone in this world. That sort of helps, but it is a difficult thing to detect, to prove, and to stop. And so again, here diplomacy will continue to play a big role, I think.
Since we mentioned Starlink, we know that there are multiple mega constellations, and Starlink being one of them. These constellations are being increasingly used in conflict zones. And if a particular operator of such a constellation were to let certain citizens in a conflict zone use it without permission from the sovereign, from the country, what are the implications for such a constellation? Does it automatically become a military target by having participated in the conflict?
Yeah, this is a very topical and important question, and I have someone doing PhD research on it, and it's very hard to answer it. And it is something that is happening both in Russia-Ukraine war and in Iran-US-Israel conflict, and um, uh, that private systems, private satellites, are being relied on as really critical infrastructure for parties in a conflict. And so the question is, does that engage the state in some way? Is the state responsible? Do the satellites become legitimate targets? The law of wars would apply. So I don't have a ready answer for you there. It's all about the system of attribution, state responsibility, and there's no clear answer about it. I would be hesitant to say that, for instance, Starlink being used in Ukraine makes the US a party in the war and the satellite legitimate targets, because state responsibility is a little bit different in space law than it is in general international law or in the laws of war. But it's certainly something that is increasingly going to be a problem. And we have also in the Iran conflict, we had a planet that was prohibited from distributing its images because they were sensitive. So there also you have a conflict between the state and the company inside one country. So that whole issue of state responsibility, of the relations between the state and its private entities, is something that becomes much heavier than it was in the past, because it can have far-reaching consequences in situations of conflict or otherwise. So it puts the burden really on the state to make sure that, that the company doesn't put the national security of the country at risk, because that would be, of course, very bad. But we also see a very big dependency of the military on one company, even to provide its satellite service. So that is a dangerous development that I'm quite worried about. Yeah,
And clearly makes for a good PhD research topic.
absolutely. Yeah.
So finally, I have a question where I would want you to project the future. If we look ahead to 25 years from now, like 2050, if you could design, keeping the future in mind, if you could design one new international legal instrument for outer space from scratch now, a treaty, a framework, a law, what would it be, and why is it the most urgent?
That is a very interesting question, and I wish I had a crystal ball, or that I could project something and that it would actually happen. One instrument, so it would mean I have to decide now what is the most urgent thing, and I really think that is that continuation of having access to outer space and being able to use it for the benefit of humanity. So I would probably go for something related to long-term sustainability and the protection of that, so that we can do all those other things, right? And then the rest can follow. But if we don't get this right, then I think that it would not make anything else possible either. So I would probably go for something related to debris, long-term sustainability, peaceful cooperation, in a nice binding treaty.
Thank you. Thank you, Tanja. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Same for me. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you all for listening. Stay tuned for our next episode. Refer to our website, spaceportsarabhai.org, for more discussions, debates, dialogues, an explainer series, the new Space India podcast, and a newsletter about the progress of India's space program.